The theme is a little bit different from the rest of other presenters have given until up to now, I think. And the theme is also very broad, and it's impossible to talk within short term. So I would only choose some subject within it. And first, because of this reason, I want to confirm about today's premises. And premises means, first I will focus on various factors as facts, not as a political subject. Actually, because of this title, War on Terror, probably many of you would feel it's something political subject, but it's nothing to do with political subject. It's only one case study using this war on terror, and because of that, it's only various factors treating as the fact. And this is the reason why I would ignore whether each argument could be beneficial or advantageous or disadvantageous to any particular country, such as Japan, US, China, Russia, EU, or whatever. And also use of such old-fashioned terminology such as pro-American, anti-American, pro-Russian, anti-Russian, pro-Japan, anti-Japan. And also, let's forget about right-wing or left-wing, that sort of political terms, as if we are still in the Cold War time. It's ended many, many years ago already. And on that basis of premise, I'm going to talk about my subject. And the introduction again, I will focus on the problems caused by the lack of international consensus on how to deal with international terror attacks. Actually, I'm based in London, and particularly the first half of this year, there are many series of terror attacks in various ways. So it's a daily issue for us when we should be in the center of London, which of course it's unpredictable when we are going to be attacked. But still we have to think whether it's really necessary for us to be in the center of London today, or whether it's really necessary for us to use underground, means we can use another way like bus. So every time we have to rethink it. So this is a serious subject for us, everybody living in the UK. And I would argue that the lack of consensus has meant that international law has been applied in an inconsistent manner, which creates fundamental issues with the international justice system and subsequently pose many ethical issues. And today, given time constraints, I will focus on some of, as I said, case study. By the way, I'm not here as a professional scholar. My presentation is rather on the basis of my own area where how I felt rather than logical argument. So in the question and answer time, please don't ask me this person said in that book and that person said in that book, because I probably haven't read it. And today's argument for today, it's very simple. First, in January 2002, when American President George W. Bush, I refer his name as, in an easy way, Bush Jr., because his father was also the president, and his name is George W. H. Smith, as H. Bush. So George W. H. Bush and George W. Bush, very confusing. So the father's case, Bush Jr., Senior, and I'm already confused. And the son's case is Bush Jr. And George W. Bush Jr. declared war on terror in his annual presidential speech. And I was told at that time, only within this room, from the American intelligence, that it was very important why he declared war on terror. Because when you declare war on terror, then the entire international law is in a different stage, called the law of war. And when we are in the stage under the law of war, then possibly, or more likely, it's predictable that it provides an excuse for excessive use of force and make it easier to hurt civilians without being charged by the illegal punishment for those officers and men who mistakenly killed and injured people, because it's under the law of war. In normal peaceful life, if you kill somebody, then it's a murder. And in the case of some armed gangsters are fighting on the street, and if you are a police officer and decided that it's necessary to use some guns to hit back, and you try to hit the youngsters and mistakenly hit some innocent street walkers, then you are going to be punished. That is a normal society. However, under the law of war, you are not going to be punished. You don't need to take a responsibility. And therefore, dropping bombs for just one terrorist, creating a lot of casualties, is allowed. That's how in Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan, hundreds of thousands of people lost houses and many people lost lives and injured, but nobody who dropped the bombs have taken responsibility for this. This is because it's under the law of war. However, if it's under the law of war, then Geneva Convention must be applied for. And under the Geneva Convention, when we capture the enemy warriors here, you have to respect that person as a POWs, prisoners of war. And at the end of the Second World War, many Japanese officers and men were prosecuted, and around 1,000 were executed because of the violation of this. Because during the wartime, with a shortage of manpower, those officers and men used the POW's manpower to construct trains and many other facilities. Not only the torturous subject, but all that sort of activities without respecting the enemy's warriors is a crime. Nonetheless, when the Allies capture the enemy warriors, i.e. the Al-Qaeda members, ISIS members, Taliban members, former Saddam Hussein's army's members, it's not necessary, they haven't in reality treated them as POWs. They treated those people as criminals. So it's a strange mixture. On the one hand, it's under the law of war. So many civilians have been injured and killed, and nobody took responsibility. However, on the other hand, Geneva Convention is not applied for. So there is clear disarray. But it's not often argued this way. We just accepted it. And here it's a notion presented by the then head of MI5. It's a British intelligence security organization, mainly in charge of domestic troubles. But with the IRA, IRA in Northern Ireland for independence, it's an independence movement terrorists, which have exploded a lot in London and other areas. And if those IRA members are involved in India or in Africa or anywhere, then MI5 is also going to be involved in that region, in India, in Africa, anywhere. So MI5 in charge of domestic issues doesn't mean they are acting only in domestic arena. but it's all over the world. And the head of MI5 said, the 9/11 terrorist, that activities is a crime, not an act of war. And therefore, I never felt it helpful to refer to a war on terror. Because when they capture, if you are serious to think it's under the law of war, then you have to respect Geneva Convention. So you cannot treat those people as terrorists. And that is how the British authorities have been frustrated by the American notion of war on terror. And that's how legal and ethical confusion has been created. This is the essence of what I want to talk today. And the argument, yes, that is the same thing. And then, this is how the lady, the head of MI5, said it. It's on your desk, so you can carefully read it. So I will not read it again here repeatedly. And then I will skip this because this is almost repetitive. So again, you could read it on the textbook on the desk later. The same. Now, when we are thinking what is the real problem behind it, that is, there is no international consensus on the definition of terrorism, first of all. And we cannot agree on who is enemy, the enemy, if enemy is a terrorist. And the North Korean issue is a good example. The Japanese and American governments are very frustrated, always saying the same thing. Just we international community should be in one. And we have to cooperate together to put North Korea isolated. But China would not put sanctions on North Korea enough. Russia is not doing that enough, so on, so on, so on. However, there's no consensus between South Korea, China, Russia, Japan, and the US. So it's impossible, simply. And so we have to define who is the enemy. And also, how to govern the use of military force to combat terror attacks by non-state actors. In this case, in this particular case, the US position on attacking Afghanistan and Iraq, the US have never declared war on Afghanistan and Iraq. Why? Because they already declared war on terror. And attacking in Afghanistan and Iraq is just part of this war. It's a simply military operation. And it's not necessary to declare war on each country. Because if terrorist is there, then you have to attack. That is the concept. However, the problem is that we are not declaring on a state anymore. We are declaring on these non-state actors. And that's why it's more confused. Because when people were injured and killed, for what? It's not very clear. And the next question. The government responsibility is what? Under a civilian government, means modern, democratic country, people pay tax to have their lives and properties protected. It's a kind of insurance. You are paying tax to the government, and in turn the government would guarantee or are responsible to protect your lives and property. And to protect them, one argument is that we need to strengthen security for protecting civilians by declaring the war on terror. However, what if the fight against terrorists provides an excuse for excessive use of force and made it easier to hurt civilians, as I mentioned, and created collateral harm? Then, whose lives does the government protect? It's not clear. It's disarray again. And in the vicious circle, there is no conclusion. That is where we are now. And I will skip this. I will come back later if it's necessary. Now, the easiest way of solving this by the government side is just to change the terminology. Instead of calling POWs, at the moment in the war on terror, it's the Taliban members, the ISIS members, and Al-Qaeda members are called unlawful combatants. And if they are defined as unlawful combatants, in theory, the Geneva Convention is not applied for, because they are not the POWs. They are not the enemy warriors, but simply unlawful combatants. And in the case of immediately after the Second World War, the Japanese soldiers, officers and men, captured, after surrendered to the Allies. Some of them were forced to continue to fight against the fellow Japanese. And many of them were also in work contractions. And it's not a war crime, because they are called Japanese surrendered personnel, JSP. So in the same sense, if you change the name, and simply they are not the POWs, then can we escape from the Geneva Convention? Is it that easy solution? And this is where the ethical problem is arising. And there are perception gaps. The question is, those who are fighting for freedom, liberation, for a cause, to change an unjust regime, they believe it's unjust regime, then they would start to fight and believe they are freedom fighters. That is one side. The other side, on the police side, those who are fighting against terrorists, who do not respect law and using violence illegally. These two camps are always there. And I want to quote from Nelson Mandela's friends. Nearly 15 years ago, I was in South Africa and met one of Nelson Mandela's friends. And he guided me into that notorious prison where Nelson Mandela was kept for more than 3 decades. And he was there together with him because he was Nelson Mandela's co-fighters and fought against apartheid. And that's why he was also captured in the same place. And I asked him, why you fought? And he said, do you ask why I fought? Because we thought the society is wrong. Apartheid was wrong. But there was no other way to change. So we fought. And at that time, we called ourselves as freedom fighters. But they called us terrorists. Not only the then South Korean government under apartheid, but also British government called us terrorists. And 30 years later, when Nelson Mandela was released, then they are invited into London, and a big music concert and whole celebration. And surprisingly, the same British government called us freedom fighters. And in retrospect, he felt whether he was a freedom fighter or a terrorist, that was the same action, same speech, was seen from simply different angle. And that's why he doesn't believe freedom fighter or terrorist, that sort of connotation. He said we have to be very, very careful to define who is terrorist. And that's the reason why the South African country will never join war on terror, because we don't believe such a thing. And I asked him, are you going to fight again in the future if you felt the society is wrong again? And he said, if apartheid came back or something else came back, yes, we are going to fight again. However, it is a time by Nelson Mandela stating that we are going to create build a rainbow country with various different type of people to cooperate to build a country. So at the moment, we abandoned those ideas of fighting. But yes, if we thought this society is impossible to change and wrong, and I'm quite impressed by that. And this is my basic part of the speech. And now we are looking at the modern time. Modern times means 20 years later now. Catalonia is trying to be independent. Kurdistan is trying to be independent. Of course, I'm not going to be involved in detail of this because it's so complicated subject. However, one problem is that when we are talking about a nation or state, what does it mean? I discussed with Professor Takahashi yesterday a lot on this subject. And in the idea of social contract, we are talking about state and population's relationship that is within a state. And social contract concept is weak when we are talking about state and state relationship. And particularly when we are talking about minority within the state, again it's very weak in theory. Because France is France, the French are French, that is the idea. The Germans are Germans, Germany is Germany. However, when we are in even population, it's controversial, but most of Japanese believe they're the same Japanese. Under that circumstances, we can see the meaning of the voting system, whether the tax rate should be raised or not. If even one person is excess, then the other, probably they are very frustrated, but still you have to follow the majority side. And that is very clear. But in the case of Catalonia, if the certain population is in one corner, and their population, number of population is less than half, then in the modern voting system would never able to reflect those voices. And eventually they want to be independent because that is the only way to respect own language, own culture, that sort of value. Because the central government cannot say, okay, like Congo's case, 465 languages. We would allow all of you to speak 465 languages. That is impossible. And therefore, if you want to respect your neighbors' ideology, identity, culture, then probably under this system, we need to create each of new countries. And most of the central government is afraid of seeing this situation. But the war nowadays, most of wars and terrorism are occurring within the territory. Civil wars in Iraq, civil wars in Yugoslavia, civil wars in Syria. So the number of countries is nothing to do with the occurrence of those terrorism and wars. So we have to fundamentally rethink what is international regime, what is international law. And if we want to rebuild, to adopt this new era, then before creating law, we need to have more consensus on ethical issue, ethical value, sense of value. If we are completely falling apart with this, then we cannot create any effective new law. And we haven't discussed on this subject enough yet. That is what I feel. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very refreshing, different subject, and very interesting and very related to our era. So first I would like to see if somebody has a question. Yes.
Good afternoon, sir. I remember the Kosovo War. During the 80s, I think the KLA, or the Kosovo Liberation Army, was called terrorist by the US government. But by the time they sided with the Kosovo Albanians, they are now the freedom fighters. And they went against international law to recognize Kosovo.
Exactly.
So I think the UN is there for everyone to, the consensus should be in the UN, and the US has to follow whatever the consensus is.
Yes, exactly. So it's a comment.
Yes.
You gave me the supporting evidence. Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? Oh, you have a question?
But mine is not a question, it's just a comment.
Yeah.
I mean, yesterday, one of the colleagues, a professor here from Japan, was looking at this issue of the dialectics. Oh, I mean, he was talking the issue of dialectics and the question of thesis and antithesis. And if you look at those who believe in Marxian term, the issue of the superstructure and the base, what determines the other? In other words, if you look at it in that scenario, ethics are part of the superstructure, they're not base. In other words, if you look at wars, as you said rightly, if you look at most of the conflicts now, wars, they happen within the state, not between states. You will find that the biggest problem is not the ethical issue. The ethical is part of the superstructure. The problem are socio-economic factors in power relations. Who determines the superstructure? Who determines the distribution of resources? That's why you find internal conflict become more pronounced when the economic situation is very bad. And the same thing perhaps with the situation in Spain. What will the situation be if the economics of the country were better than it was before? Because Spain now is facing a lot of economic problems. The same thing if you look at internationally, and the question of these power groups, which are almost a creation of the Americans, whether in Iraq or in Afghanistan or wherever they. So I think the question of turning the whole thing, the ethical issue, as part of the whole structure, why it's just part of the superstructure. I think we need to consider the socio-economic, political dynamics in power structure in countries to see how do they reflect into ethical issues.
Yes, I think you helped me to find out how to solve this. Actually, I'm here today to ask you what is your ideas to solve this, because I have thought on a very pragmatic and practical basis how to solve this, and I don't have very clear answer on this. And it's now called the new normal area after Brexit, after Trump is elected, after many other elections, the referendums in Kurdistan, in Catalonia, many things have occurred in the last 2 years, and every time people have been surprised. But it's going on and on. From probably we still have 1.5 months now, and within this 1.5 months now, more changes is coming. Next year probably it's more chaotic. And under the circumstances, when we call it the new normal, but what is a new order? That is not clear. Some people are saying probably we are going to see the clear next order in the next 30 years, 40 years. We never know what will come. And thinking of why it happened, then as you mentioned, the riches and the poor, that sort of gap is one idea. And when the authority of the United Nations going declining, the US is still powerful, but in comparative sense, China is rising, Russia is rising, many countries are rising. So in comparative sense, the US as the only superpower is declining in the international community. So this is structurally more and more possible to be chaotic. And how to solve this? And this poor and riches and poor gap is one issue. And we have to solve it. But we don't want to have the so-called universal government. Because if the president of universal government is a dictator, then nobody can resist. And therefore, we don't want to have that kind of system. But also, we don't want to have any anarchy. So, what I'm now thinking is to see how to change the international structure. For example, Catalonia became independent, Basque would be independent, Scotland would be independent. What is the merit and demerit of it? And nowadays, I think it's less important to see the demerit. For instance, I was working for the British government in the late 1990s. And when I joined there, we could control the whole of the UK territory. But during my time, only for 4 years, I saw Wales left, Scotland left, Northern Ireland left, because their autonomy power is becoming more and more promoted and becoming stronger. And that's why they had their own government. And they started to say, no, it's London side, we would go different way. And we had to accept it. So when I left in 4 years, the territory was only England. And I was very surprised. Those colleagues, the British national, did not care. They said that, okay, so Scotland can be independent. But if on the new boundary between Scotland and England, if there is any taxation is imposed, going to be imposed, no, both sides would feel it's going to lose on both sides because of the free trade benefit would be lost. And therefore, it's not happening. So what's the demerit? And they finally said that the US used to be part of the UK, Australia used to be part of the UK, New Zealand used to be part of the UK, but they all left. And that is our tradition. So why not Scotland? They can go, because that is our tradition. And I started to think that is one wisdom. One wisdom. In a strange way, I thought, oh, probably this is a solution. So the question is, if at the end of the war, there are only 50 countries, now 200 after decolonization, probably not yet enough, but still. In the future, probably 800, 1,000. But when it became 1,000, in comparison with immediately after the war, Second World War, 50, is it more difficult to manage international community or not? 50 versus 1,000. I started to think it's hard to believe it's more difficult simply because of the number of countries increased. Because of the civil wars, so many civil wars are going on. So whatever, it's a smaller number of countries or larger number of countries, if we cannot solve those community problems, if we fail to respect other culture, each other, then it's continued to be in conflict all the time. So how to create the new international law and how to create our technique to communicate between the two sides, that is, or multiple sides, that is our wisdom we are going to face. We need to have it. That is, if we want to be optimistic in this new chaotic time, then that is the theme, I think. Economically, also it's the same. In Africa, for example, lots of boundaries are there. And it's difficult to cross beyond the border without being taxed and other political barriers. But if that is going to be more widely, the border concept is changing, then probably my job to promote African economy, that could be easier. And we can enjoy more scale merit. And that's the reason why I want to present today ethic and international law and probably domestic law, how we should be created in a hurry, and we need some consensus. Sorry, it's a very long answer.
Yeah, so I just have one comment. There was a distinction in the beginning, if you remember, when they invaded Afghanistan, it was considered a failed state. And Al-Qaeda members in Afghanistan were not Afghan citizens, they were Arab, they were foreign fighters.
Yes.
Somalia too.
Yes.
The problem was when they decided to invade Iraq, where there were no foreign fighters and it was a sovereign state and it was not a failed state. So I think still you could make that distinction and say when there is a failed state and there are criminals, we can go and treat them as criminals that are using this opportunity to work in a failed state as terrorists, but with sovereign states, no foreign fighters, it shouldn't be allowed. But it was done, and nobody could do anything because USA had, the power to do it, and nobody is even following that. So, you see, I mean, they don't even respect the law, and you want them to respect ethics. It's hard to make them.
It's true, but again, it's true. It's a very important point. But again, I'm not sure whether Afghanistan is simply a failed state. In the case of Iraq, yes, because just before American invasion, the Baghdad market was even in boom. It's booming, and then suddenly cut off. And by American standard, yes, it was under dictatorship. But it's a question whether for Iraqi nationals, whether majority of them thought it or not. Because yes, there was not a voting system, effective voting system, but there was a stability. And in that sense, Iraq situation was much better than the case of Afghanistan. But again in Afghanistan, why it became failed state? Because during the kingdom time, it was not so bad. And then the Russians came, the Americans came, the civil wars came. So when we decide which is a failed state, that is another question, and who would decide it? And so under international argument, the developed countries should intervene to rescue those people. That is the concept when they attacked Taliban. They attacked Taliban, not the people, to rescue. And in Iran's case, again, it's to rescue the people from the dictatorship. But who would define its dictatorship in the different sense of value? And I was very surprised in the case of Iraq. They said the Saddam Hussein's personal telephone number was available on the newspaper. And if they call, he himself appears. And they can talk to him about their own problem between wife and husband. And that is a kind of nomadic society's custom. And that is different from Western style of voting system. And if that is the way of stabilizing the society, then we understand why the current regime cannot stabilize the country. So again, it's a different sense of value, difference of culture, so we need to respect that. And so in a sense, yes, you're correct, but who would define it's a failed state and it's a dictatorship?
Thank you. My question for you, thank you for your excellent talk, is I often discussed with my mentor, Bioethics, who was a colleague in UNESCO, this question of humanitarian intervention and the demand of human rights conventions that if I see human rights abuse, I need to intervene, versus state sovereignty. So it's a convenient excuse not to intervene that you have state sovereignty sometimes. So we see selective interventions if there's oil or some other resources, but ignorance of people's human rights abuses if there's no financial benefit. So how can we balance, because I think it's a demand of the human rights conventions that if I see an abuse in another country, I need to intervene to protect people being abused. But the countries often argue state sovereignty, so don't intervene.
Yes.
How do we deal with that?
Yes.
What's the future of this?
Yes, non-intervention principle is one real issue, as you mentioned. And for instance, Catalans, why Catalonians want to be independent? Because in the past, for centuries, they had some bad memory of terrible oppression. And as long as they are part of Spain, even when they are given the highest autonomy, still, when something wrong happens, the other countries cannot intervene or excuse for not intervening. And if it's your completely sovereign state, then it's a bit different. And therefore, whether you are completely sovereign independent state or you are part of highly autonomous position of another state, that is a very, very different thing. That's why people start to feel anxiety if it's just a part of the other state. And that is another point we want to rethink that kind of non-intervention policy and territorial integrity principles, whether that is right or not. But if you just denied it, then it's again chaotic. The stronger country would take another territory easily. So again, that is ethic problem. We have to see where our majority of people could be happy or happier. That is my thing. I need your help.
Thank you.
Thank you very
You
much,
have it.
Dr. Komatsu.
Thank you.
So we are going to have a few minutes.